me see if I can show you some of the nasty crud that builds up in there. This is probably the grossest part right here. So as much as possible, I like to knock any of the solid or semi-solid stuff off of here and out of all my little nooks and crannies. And then when I've got the bulk of the solid material out of here, I'll rinse the whole thing out with some distilled water. Alright, and you can hear it actually draining. I'm going to wipe a little of my excess out of here. But yeah, the first most important area you want to clean up is the area, the carriage that holds your print cartridges. Your next most important area to keep clean is your service station, especially this part right here with these little blades, these little rubber blades. And then the third area that it's super critical that you keep clean, and I'm going to slide my printing gantry forward to get to this. Back here, this thing right here, this little backstop, these are called the parking caps. And they're sort of like little soft rubber enclosures that your print heads actually slam up against after each pass. And they are another part of the process for removing extra ink and built up material from them. And you can see there's always a little bit of loose powder and such that builds up around them. I'm going to turn on my vacuum a second and just pull up some of my loose powder from around this. While I'm at it, I'm noticing a little bit of powder that's built up on top of my print arm, so I'm just going to go ahead and hit that as well. At the very minimum, when I'm working on my parking caps, I like to just swab them down with a Q-tip and make sure that most of the dust around them is free. And you can see those guys do pick up a lot of ink. They do get dirty. Hey there, Austin. If I find that it's really being stubborn, or if I just prefer to, I also have the option of actually peeling this soft rubber part off the front of my parking cap assembly. And I'm going to do that just so we can see what's going on there. See if I can pick up a little ink off of these guys. There we go. And again, if you can get to it conveniently and you can get them solidly clean without pulling it off, you don't have to remove this part. It's actually got these little ribbed rubber things here that snap into holes on the back of that assembly. And there's a way that it will go and a way that it won't. And it's something that I find handy, a mnemonic that helps me recall which way this thing actually orients. If we have our sort of wide, squat color cartridge that goes on our right-hand side. Let me make sure that's seated properly. And if we have our black print head that goes on our left-hand side, then our parking cap cover is going to look kind of the same. It's going to have the long, skinny one on the left and the shorter, wider one on the right. So that's a good way of remembering which direction this thing actually snaps back in place. But the center hole is offset in such a way to where it just won't go the other way. So there is also that. And if you end up with a lot of crud or accumulation around this thing, you can also certainly grab a Q-tip and swab the worst of that out. It's relatively clean right now because we just finished doing a major service on this thing, but you can see how after even a single job, you can get an awful lot of crud built up in here. So your three things that you want to make absolutely sure you clean every single time: your parking caps, your service station, and the carriage for your print heads, and of course the print heads themselves. I just remembered one minor detail that I would like to make sure that I get in here while I'm talking about these print cartridges. One part of this carriage that I didn't talk about. I'm going to use another one of these alcohol crush tubes here. And you're going to have a really challenging time getting a picture of this. The part of this thing that goes against all of these little gold contacts right here on both of these little assemblies where you've got a bunch of these brass pins. I don't know if it's possible to get the camera in there or not. These brass pins right here, those are referred to as pogos. And you always want to take a crush tube and wipe up those pogos and make sure that those contacts are nice and clean, free of ink, free of dirt. Because if you're not making good contact on those, you are going to be in a world of hurt. And again, you want to use alcohol on this part because you want the alcohol to evaporate. You don't want to slog a bunch of water in there on those electrical contacts. You just want to wipe down those little brass pogos. All right. Man, those were actually in surprisingly good shape. Excellent. But basically, when you're servicing this thing, you absolutely, even if you're in a big hurry, you absolutely hit those three areas. Printing, service station, and parking cabs. I'm going to secure the latch on this guy right here. Slide him back. Close this up. You can see I've got a little bit of gunk right here. And this is mostly just me liking to run a tight ship, but when I'm cleaning this up, I'll also do things like pick out some of this stuff right here. This is one of the only areas where I've actually got an example of the kind of like weird like 3D printer mud that will build up. On a big job, you'll see a whole bunch of crud like this. But it does tend to accumulate around here because this is that area where you've got, you know, you've got your wet print head, your wet binder, your wet ink mixing with a little bit of loose powder as it spills. So if I didn't see to this for 2 or 3 jobs, it would be filthy. Wipe up the loose of that. As long as everything is relatively dry in here, if I've got bits and pieces like this, it is perfectly cool for me to turn on my vacuum. And pull up all my bits and stuff like that. Because what I can then do, as soon as the vacuum dies out, what I can then do is pull my debris tray out and just discard that stuff. And here is where my little stubby bristled silver brush comes in. And you don't have to be worried about getting every last little bit of powder out of every single one of the holes in this grid. If you just give this thing a good wipe down, that's going to get it clean enough to where it will work just fine. Every so often I come in here and I put this thing in a supersonic cleaner and I really go to town on it. But just for like day-to-day when you're turning it around to go from one batch of models to the next, you just hit it with this little short bristled brush. And that cleans it out quite thoroughly enough to where it'll do the job. There is one more thing that I sometimes like to do. If you look at the area inside where that debris trap goes, and I'm going to try to stand to the side, very often you'll get, mostly just because of static electricity, but sometimes because of like ambient humidity, you'll get a little bit of loose powder that likes to build up around the sides and top. And I like to take a brush and just knock that stuff loose. And what I do is I literally just sweep it out into my bill tray area. And I'll vacuum that stuff up. Obviously, you'll want to wait until your debris trap is back in. Sooner or later, you're going to have one of those brain fart moments where you fire up your vacuum and it's like, oh, that's not doing much. My debris trap is sitting in my hands. And you'll have a good chuckle and hope that nobody was looking at you. Happened to me.
there's a lot of loose powder like in the back. Is that okay?
There is. Yeah. As this thing runs, it gets loose powder all back in there, and every once in a while I open this thing up to do service and replace the waste tray. Down inside the guts of this thing, if I haven't gotten to it for a while, I might have 10 or 12 pounds of loose powder that gradually accumulate down in this thing. But that's you guys don't need to be worried about that, at least not right now. At some point, if there are any of you who are like super sharp and super on top of this stuff, who are just really excited about helping me maintain this thing, yeah, I might show you how to crack that open and do that. But for now, yes, loose powder does build up back in the guts of this thing. That's something that I basically split between me and the licensed service technician from ADEX who comes out here and does like a once or twice a year service call on this thing. So, good question. Yeah, it does show up. Don't worry about it. Let me worry about that. If I can count on you guys to help me keep those three major components on this thing clear, we are going to be in excellent shape. It is robust enough that if you just do that, it'll take a licking and keep on ticking. All right. So that's basically, and this is about the fastest I've ever gotten through it because we did such a small model. That's basically what you do. Again, if you're cleaning up after a big job, you may spend a lot more time working on that stuff than I did, but those are the components to keeping your service station clean. So let's call this cleaned up and ready to roll. Let's say we were going to turn this around and get ready to run another job now. I would put all of this stuff away. Put my service mirror back up. Forgive me for a second, I'm about to sneeze. This is totally uncool. Yeah, that's going to make good copy. All right. Put my service station lid back now. Set my paper towels aside for a moment. Put my tape away. So let's assume that we've done our maintenance, we've cleaned everything up, we've got the loose powder out of the build area, we've vacuumed the loose powder out of our service area. Thing's good, it's ready to roll. You know, because stuff like this bothers me, if I were doing this for real, I'd probably take my brush and I'd vacuum up all the loose powder that I spilled here. But in the interests of time and expediency, I'm going to roll right on into this, and I'm basically going to show you how I would do the setup if I were printing the exact same model that I was before. One last thing I'm going to do before I walk away from the printer and we start looking at the computer for a second. Notice how the build tray is a little bit below the top level of this frame around it right here. If I punch my shovel ring here and I go down to my second option, prep build chamber, and punch that, it's going to give me a cue here. It says, ensure build chamber is empty and service station is clean. Well, build chamber is empty. I've removed all my powder. Service station is reasonably clean. So I'm going to click continue. And you can see it's just going to raise up and then that nasty little grinding noise. That's it sort of pushing against its hard limit stop, just making sure that this thing is plus or minus a couple thousandths of an inch where it thinks it's supposed to be. That's a super critical thing. You always want to prep build chamber before you get ready to print a model so that it knows it's starting out at the right level. It's been a long time since I've tested it on this, but one of the cool things about these old Z printers is that I don't think it will actually let you run a job if you don't do that first. I think it'll just pop up a window and nag you. But don't test it on that. Just remember that it's always important to prep the build chamber. There is actually one more thing that it is my personal preference to do before I run a model, and that is because in the real world you run into all sorts of strange properties that this powder will have. In my experience, the stuff is slightly sensitive to changes in temperature, it's slightly sensitive to changes in humidity, and so to make sure that the powder spreads properly and it deposits properly and that you don't run into what's called short spreading, and sadly, short spreading is something I should talk to you guys about, because sooner or later you're going to have a bad day where you see it happen. Short spreading is where when it rakes that layer of powder forward, you'll see these tiny little gaps on the front edge right here where the powder didn't quite make it all the way forward. The way this is supposed to work is you have a little bit of excess on every layer, just a little dusting of excess powder that falls off into this catched area here. This actually feeds into what's called the front overflow reservoir. This thing's got a rear overflow reservoir where it catches most of the stuff that falls in the back, and it's got a front overflow where it catches most of the stuff that falls in the front. And then periodically it'll either automatically recycle that powder back into its main build reservoir, or you can do it manually, and I may actually show you that in a minute. But every once in a while you'll find that the powder doesn't quite spread the way it's supposed to. One of the ways I prevent that from causing us problems when we're printing models, and this is my own best practices here. I'm going to go to build chamber, and there's a command under build chamber called fill bed. I'm going to go down and manually do fill bed. And I can't remember whether it'll let me do this with the cover open or not. It's going to tell me any second now. Close cover is what that beep is telling me. So I'm going to do that. Now it'll be really interesting to see, because I have this sort of tinted window covering material over this window right here. I don't know if the camera's going to be able to make that out or not.
No.
Okay. Well, then what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up after it spreads a layer, just so you guys can see what it's doing. But basically, it's got this hopper that sits up above the build tray, and it's getting the precise quantity of powder from one layer, fluffed out and put in place, and it's going to dump it down there, and it's going to take a long, thin blade and rake it forward. And if it works properly, you're going to get a nice, even layer of powder spread out over this thing. I'm going to interrupt it for a second, and it's going to beep at me. But you can see, as it spreads its very first layer, it only makes it a little bit of the way across the platen at the bottom of this build tray. Yes, I know. If I go back and watch this over several passes, it's eventually going to completely cover this thing. But this is... short spreading is when this sort of thing happens when it's not filling up the bed. And every once in a while, it'll throw you a curve like that. I'll talk a little bit about how to anticipate that and how to compensate for it. For now, I'm going to let this Corp printer get back to its job. So it's going to fill up the bed with about 3/16 of an inch of loose powder or so. Now I've manually changed the settings as far as 3D print settings in ZPrint, so that on top of this manual fill bed command that I'm doing right now, it's automatically, before it goes into the model that I'm about to tell it to print, it's going to do another fill bed command. So we're going to have almost half an inch of powder in the bottom of this thing. And unless I've got a batch of models so big I need every millimeter of space, I'm going to go ahead and let it do those two fill bed commands, just to make sure I've got a solid amount of powder in the bottom of my build tray. And again, that's my best practices based on me fighting this particular machine.
So you're saying you do one manually and then it does one automatically?
I do. Well, it's become part of my rhythm as I set up for a 3D print. It's like, I gotta manually do prep build chamber before I go, and so as soon as I do prep build chamber, I then do a fill bed command, and then I turn my attention over to my model and my invoice, which is going to be the next thing that we talk about. Good question, thank you. That's exactly what I do. So this is going to complete that process, and you will notice just about everything that this printer does is slow. It is so slow. It's slow for a reason. This thing is methodical, and it has a bunch of sensors in it that tell it what it's doing, so that you really have to work to screw this thing up, but boy, trust me, I've found lots of ways to do it anyway. But the reason the process is so slow is it's constantly checking and scanning and auditing itself. This thing actually has a pretty good idea of what's happening in its own little world at any given moment. And it even goes so far as to pop up maintenance cues. Like if there's a vital piece of maintenance you haven't done in a while, and with any luck, we'll see one when we do our 3D print in a second. It'll give you a cue that says, hey, you haven't cleaned the service station in a while, you haven't changed the waste tray in a while, you haven't lubed the axis bearings in a while. There's also, once in a while, you'll need to get a little grease gun out and lube some bearings on here. I'll talk about that in a little bit. I want to wait and see if our menu happens to pop that message up when I get ready to set the job. But it's smart enough that it actually does a pretty good job of telling you what's going on. And even what I really like about it is with most of those, if it says, hey, you need to do such and such maintenance thing, you have the option of saying, yeah, okay, I did it, or I'm